on the big canvas wall and packing everything into the wagons while the sky was still dark the next morning. It was the clatter and banging of it, the shouting, that woke Matt, groggy and stiff from sleeping on the floor, as much as he could sleep, for the bloody dice. Those things gave a man dreams that slaughtered sleep. Luca was rushing about in his shirt sleeves with a lantern, giving orders and likely impeding matters as much as speeding them. But Petra, wide enough to seem squat, though he was not all that much shorter than Matt, paused in hitching the four-horse team to his and Clarine's wagon to explain. With the waning moon low on the horizon and half hidden by trees, a lantern on the driver's seat gave all the light they had, a flickering pool of yellow that was repeated 100 times and more through the camp. Clarine was off walking the dogs, since they would be spending most of the day inside the wagon. Yesterday, the strong man shook his head and patted the nearest animal, patiently waiting for the last straps to be buckled, as if the horse had showed signs of nerves. Maybe he felt edgy himself. The night was only cool, not really cold, yet he was bundled up in a dark coat and had on a knitted cap. His wife worried about him falling sick from drafts or the cold, and took care that he would not. Well, we're strangers everywhere, you see, and a lot of people think they can take advantage of strangers. But if we let one man get away with it, 10 more will try, if not 100. Sometimes the local magistrate or what passes for one will uphold the law for us too, but only sometimes. Because we're strangers, and tomorrow or the next day we'll be gone, and anyway, everybody knows strangers are usually up to no good. So we have to stand up for ourselves, fight for what's ours if need be. Once you do that, though, it's time to move along. Same now as when there were only a few dozen of us with Luca, counting the horse handlers, though in those days we'd have been gone as soon as those soldiers left. In those days, there weren't so many coins to be lost by leaving in a hurry, he said dryly, and shook his head, perhaps for Luca's greed, or perhaps for how large the show had grown, before going on. Those 3 Shawn-chan have friends, or at least companions who won't like their own being faced down. That standard bearer did it, but you can be sure they'll lay it to us, because they think they can hit at us, and they can't at her. Maybe their officers will uphold the law or their rules or whatever, like she did, but we can't be sure of that. What is certain, though, is that those fellows will cause trouble if we stay another day. No point to staying when it means fights with soldiers, and maybe people hurt so they can't perform, and sure trouble with the law one way or another. It was the longest speech Matt had ever heard from Petra, and the man cleared his throat as though embarrassed by saying so much. Well, he muttered, bending back to the harness, Luca will want to be on the road soon. You want to be seeing to your own horses. Matt wanted no such thing. The most wonderful thing about having coin was not what you could buy, but that you could pay others to do the work. As soon as he realized the show was preparing to move, he had rousted the 4 Red Arms from the tent they shared with Chel Benton to hitch the teams for his wagon and Tuon's, do as he instructed with the razor, and saddle Pips. The stout horse thief, he had not stolen a horse since Matt had known him, but that was what he was, had roused himself long enough to say that he would get up when the others returned, then rolled over in his blankets and was snoring again before Harnan and the others had their boots half on. Bennon's skills were such that no one voiced any complaint beyond the usual grumbling about the hour, and all but Harnan would have grumbled if allowed to sleep till noon. When those skills were needed, he would repay them tenfold, and they knew it. Even Fergus. The skinny red arm was none too bright except when it came to soldiering, but he was plenty smart enough there. Well, smart enough. The show left Jurador before the sun broke the horizon, a long snake of wagons rolling along the wide road through the darkness with Luca's lurid monstrosity pulled by 6 horses at its head. Tuon's wagon came just behind, with Corderin driving, almost wide-shouldered enough to seem a strong man himself, and Tuon and Selucia, well cloaked and hooded, squeezed in on either side of him. The storage wagons and animal cages and spare horses brought up the tail. Sentries at the Shawn-chan camp watched them depart, silent armored figures in the night marching the camp's perimeter. Not that the camp itself was quiet. Shadowy forms stood in rigid lines among the tents while loud voices bellowed the roll call at a steady pace, and others answered. Matt all but held his breath until those regular shouts faded away behind him. Discipline was a wonderful thing. For other men, anyway. He rode Pips alongside the Aes Sedai wagon near the middle of the long line, flinching a little every time the foxhead went cool against his chest, which it began to do before they had gone much more than a mile. It seemed that Jolene was wasting no time. Bergen, handling the reins, chattered away about horses and women with Netwin. Both were as happy as pigs in clover, but they neither had any idea what was going on inside the wagon. At least the medallion only turned cool, and barely that. They were using small amounts of the power. Still, he disliked being so near any channeling at all. In his experience, Aes Sedai carried trouble in their belt pouches, and seldom were shy about scattering it, never mind who might be in the way. No, with the dice bouncing inside his head, he could have done without Aes Sedai within 10 miles. He would have ridden up beside Tuon for the chance to talk with her, no matter that Selucia and Gordoran would hear every word, but you never wanted a woman thinking you were too eager. Do that, and she either took advantage or else skittered away like a water drop on a hot greased griddle. Tuon found enough ways to take advantage already, and he had too little time for very much in the way of chasing. Sooner or later, she would speak the words that completed the marriage ceremony, sure as water was wet. But that only made it more urgent for him to find out what she was like, which had hardly been easy so far. That little woman made a blacksmith's puzzle seem simple. But how could a man be married to a woman if he did not know her? Worse, he had to make her see him as something more than toy. Marriage to a woman with no respect for him would be like wearing a shirt of black wasp nettles day and night. Worse still, he had to make her care for him, or he would find himself forced to hide from his own wife to keep her from making him Daco Vale. And to cap it off, he had to do all of that in whatever time remained before he had to send her back to Abu Dar. A fine stew, and doubtless a tasty meal for some hero out of legend, a little something to occupy his idle time before he rushed off to perform some great deed. Only Matt Bloody Cawthon was no bloody hero. He still had it to do, though, and no time or room for missteps. It was the earliest start they had made yet, but his hopes that the Seanchan had frightened Luca into moving faster were soon dashed. As the sun climbed, they passed stone farm buildings clinging to hillsides and occasionally a tiny tile or thatch-roofed village, nestled beside the road in a surround of stone-walled fields carved out of the forest, where men and women stood gaping as the show streamed past and children ran alongside until their parents called them back. But in the mid-afternoon, the show reached something larger. Running and crossing, near a so-called river that could have been waded in fewer than 20 paces without going more than waist-deep despite the stone bridge across it, was never a patch on Jurador, but it possessed 4 inns, each 3 stories of stone roofed in green or blue tiles, and near half a mile of hard-packed dirt between the village and the river, where merchants could park their wagons for the night. Farms, with their walled fields and orchards and pastures, made a quilt of the countryside for a good league along the road, and maybe more beyond the hills to either side of it. They certainly covered the hillsides Matt could see. That was enough for Luca. Ordering the canvas wall erected in the clearing, near to the river to make watering the animals easier, the man strutted into the village wearing coat and cloak right enough to make Matt's eyes hurt, and so embroidered with golden stars and comets that a tinker would have wept for the shame of donning the garments. The huge blue and red banner was stretched across the entrance, each wagon in its place. The performing platforms unloaded and the wall nearly all up by the time he returned, escorting 3 men and 3 women. The village was not all that far from Abu Dar, yet their clothing might have come from another country altogether. The men wore short wool coats and bright colors embroidered with angular scroll work along the shoulders and sleeves, and dark baggy trousers stuffed into knee boots. The women, their hair in a sort of coiled bun atop their heads, wore dresses nearly as colorful as Luca's garments, their narrow skirts resplendent with flowers from hem to hips. They did all carry long belt knives, though with straight blades for the most part, and caressed the hilts whenever anybody looked at them. That much was the same. Altara was Altara when it came to touchiness. These were the village mayor, the 4 innkeepers, and a lean, leathery, white-haired woman in red. The others addressed her respectfully as mother. Since the round-bellied mayor was as white-haired as she, not to mention mostly bald, and none of the innkeepers lacked at least a little gray hair, Matt decided she must be the village wisdom. He smiled and tipped his hat to her as she passed, and she gave him a sharp look and sniffed in near perfect imitation of Naeem. Oh, yes, a wisdom, all right. Luca showed them around with wide smiles and expansive gestures, elaborate bows and flourishes of his cloak, stopping here and there to make a juggler or a team of acrobats perform a little for his guests. But his smile turned to a sour grimace once they were safely back on their way and out of sight. Free admission for them and their husbands and wives and all the children, he growled to Matt. And I'm supposed to pack up if a merchant comes down the road. They weren't that blunt, but they were clear enough, especially that Mother Darvale, as if this fly speck ever attracted enough merchants to fill this field. Thieves and scoundrels, Colton. Country folk are all thieves and scoundrels, and an honest man like me is at their mercy. Soon enough, he was totting up pretty minor in there, despite the complimentary admissions, but he never did give over complaining entirely, even when the line at the entrance stretched nearly as far as a Dragon Door. He just added complaining about how much he would have taken in with another 3 or 4 days at the Salt Town. It was 3 or 4 days now, and likely he would have lingered until the crowds had dwindled to nothing. Maybe those 3 Sean-Chen had been Taviran work. Not likely, but it was a pleasant way to think of it. Now that it was all in the past, it was. That was how they progressed. At best a mere 2 leagues, or perhaps 3, at an unhurried pace, and usually Luca would find a small town or a cluster of villages that he felt called for a halt. Or better to say that he felt their silver calling to him. Even if they passed nothing but fly specks not worth the labor of erecting the wall, they never made as much as 4 leagues before Luca called a halt. He was not about to risk having to camp strung out along the road. If there was not to be a show, Luca liked to find a clearing where the wagons could be parked without too much crowding, though if driven to it, he would dicker with a farmer for the right to stop in an unused pasture, and mutter over the expense the whole next day if it cost no more than a silver penny. He was tight with his purse strings, Luca was. Trains of merchants' wagons passed them in both directions, making good speed and managing to raise small clouds of dust from the hard-packed road. Merchants wanted to get their goods to market as quickly as possible. Now and then they saw a caravan of tinkers, too, their boxy wagons as bright as anything in the show except for Luca's wagon. All of them were headed toward Abu Dar, oddly enough, but then they moved as slowly as Luca. Not likely any coming the other way would overtake the show. 2 or 3 leagues a day, and the dice rattled away so that Matt was always wondering what lay beyond the next bend in the road, or what was catching him up from behind. It was enough to give a man hives. The very first night outside Runyon Crossing, he approached Eludra. Near her bright blue wagon, she had set up a small canvas enclosure 8 feet tall for launching her night flowers, and she straightened with a glare when he pulled back a flap and ducked in. A closed lantern sitting on the ground near the wall gave enough light for him to see that she was holding a dark ball the size of a large melon. Runyon Crossing was only big enough to merit a single night flower. She opened her mouth, all set to chivvy him out. Not even Luca was allowed in here. Lofting tubes, he said quickly, gesturing to a wooden tube, as tall as he was and near enough a foot across, sitting upright in front of her on a broad wooden base. That's why you want a bell thunder, to make lofting tubes from bronze. It's the why I can't puzzle out. It seemed a ridiculous idea. With a little effort, 2 men could lift one of her lofting tubes into the wagon that carried them and her other supplies. A bronze lofting tube would require a derrick. But it was the only thing that had occurred to him. With the lantern behind her, shadows hid her expression, but she was silent for a long moment. Such a clever young man, she said finally. Her beaded braids clicked softly as she shook her head. Her laugh was low and throaty. I should watch my tongue. I always get into the trouble when I make promises to clever young men. Never think I will tell you the secrets that would make you blush, though. Not now. You are already juggling 2 women, it seems, and me, I will not be juggled. Then I'm right? He was barely able to keep the incredulity from his voice. You are, she said, and casually tossed the night flower at him. He caught it with a startled oath and only dared to breathe when he was sure he had a good grip. The covering seemed to be stiff leather, with a tiny stub of fuse sticking out of one side. He had a little familiarity with smaller fireworks, and supposedly those only exploded from fire, or if you let air touch what was inside, though he had cut one open once without it going off. Yet who could say what might make a night flower erupt? The firework he had opened had been small enough to hold in one hand. Something the size of this night flower would likely blow him and Eludra to scraps. Abruptly he felt foolish. She was not very likely to go throwing the thing if dropping it was dangerous. He began tossing the ball from hand to hand, not to make up for gasping and all that, just for something to do. How will casting lofting tubes from bronze make them a better weapon? That was what she wanted, weapons to use against the Shan to repay them for destroying the Guild of Illuminators. They seem fearsome enough to me already. Eludra snatched the night flower back, muttering about clumsy oaks, and turning the ball over in her hands to examine the leather surface. Maybe it was not so safe as he had assumed. A proper lofting tube, she said, once she was sure he had not damaged the thing. It will send this close to 300 paces straight up into the sky with the right charge, and a longer distance across the ground if the tube is tilted at an angle, but not far enough.
Be right back, everyone.
A lofting charge big enough to send it further would burst the tube. With a bronze tube, I could use a charge that would send something a little smaller close to 2 miles. Making the slow match slower, to let it travel that far is easy enough. Smaller, but heavier, made of iron. And there would be nothing for pretty colors, only the bursting charge. Matt whistled through his teeth, seeing it in his head, explosions erupting among the enemy before they were near enough to see you clearly. A nasty thing to be receiving. Now that would be as good as having Aes Sedai on your side, or some of those Ashaman. Better. Aes Sedai had to be in danger to use the power as a weapon, and while he had heard rumors about hundreds of Ashaman, rumors grew with every telling. Besides, if Ashaman were anything like Aes Sedai, they would start deciding where they were needed, and then take over the whole fight. He began envisioning how to use Eludra's bronze tubes, and right away he spotted a glaring problem. All your advantage was gone if the enemy came from the wrong direction or got behind you, and if you needed derricks to move these things. These bronze lofting tubes, dragons, she broke in. Lofting tubes are for making the night flowers bloom, for delighting the eye. I will call them dragons, and the Shan will howl when my dragons bite. Her tone was grim as sharp stone. These dragons, then, whatever you call them, they'll be heavy and hard to move. Can you mount them on wheels, like a wagon or cart? Would they be too heavy for horses to pull? She laughed again. It's good to see you are more than the pretty face. Climbing a 3-step folding ladder that put her waist nearly level with the top of the lofting tube, she set the night flower into the tube with the fuse down. It slid in a little way and stopped, a dome above the top of the tube. Hand me that, she told him, gesturing to a pole as long and thick as a quarterstaff. When he handed it up to her, she held it upright and used a leather cap on one end to push the night flower deeper. That appeared to take little effort. I have already drawn plans for the dragon carts. 4 horses could draw one easily, along with a second cart to hold the eggs. Not night flowers, dragons' eggs. You see, I have thought long and hard about how to use my dragons, not just how to make them. Pulling the capped rod from the tube, she climbed down and picked up the lantern. Come, I must make the sky bloom a little. Then I want my supper and my bed. Just outside the canvas enclosure stood a wooden rack filled with more peculiar implements, a forked stick, tongs as long as Matt was tall, other things just as odd, and all made of wood. Setting the lantern on the ground, she placed the capped pole in the rack and took a square wooden box from a shelf. I suppose now you want to learn how to make the secret paladins. Well, I did promise. I am the guild now, she added bitterly, removing the box's lid. It was an odd box, a solid piece of wood drilled with holes, each of which held a thin stick. She plucked out one and replaced the lid. I can decide what is secret. Better than that, I want you to come with me. I know somebody will be happy to pay for making as many of your dragons as you want. He can make every bell founder from Andor to Tyr stop casting bells and start casting dragons. Avoiding Rand's name did not stop the colors from whirling inside his head and resolving for an instant into Rand, fully clothed, thank the light, talking with Loyal by lamplight in a wood-paneled room. There were other people, but the image focused on Rand, and it vanished too quickly for Matt to make out who they were. He was pretty sure that what he saw was what was actually happening right that moment, impossible as that seemed. It would be good to see Loyal again, but burn him, there had to be some way to keep those things out of his head. And if he isn't interested, again the colors came, but he resisted and they melted away. I can pay to have hundreds cast myself. A lot of them, anyway. The band was going to end up fighting Sean Chan and most likely Trollocs as well. And he would be there when it happened. There was no getting around the fact. Try to avoid it how he would. That bloody Taviran twisting would put him right in the bloody middle. So he was ready to pour out gold like water if it gave him a way to kill his enemies before they got close enough to poke holes in his hide. Aludra tilted her head to one side, pursing her rosebud lips. Who is this man with such power? There'll have to be a secret between us. Tom and Julian know, and Agenan and Doman and the Aes Sedai, Teslin and Jolene at least, and Bannon and the Red Arms, but nobody else. And I want to keep it that way. Blood and bloody ashes, far too many people knew already. He waited for her curt nod before saying, The Dragon Reborn. The colors swirled, and despite his fighting them again, became Rand and Loyal for a moment. This was not going to be as easy as it had seemed. You know the Dragon Reborn, she said doubtfully. We grew up in the same village, he growled, already fighting the colors. This time they nearly coalesced before vanishing. If you don't believe me, ask Teslin and Jolene. Ask Tom. But don't do it around anyone else. A secret, remember? The guild has been my life since I was a girl. She scraped one of the sticks quickly down the side of the box, and the thing sputtered into flame. It smelled of sulfur. The dragons, they are my life now. The dragons and revenge on the Shan-Chan. Bending, she touched the flame to a dark length of fuse that ran under the canvas. As soon as the fuse caught, she shook the stick until the fire went out, then dropped it. With a crackling hiss, the flame sped along the fuse. I think me I believe you. She held out her free hand. When you leave, I will go with you, and you will help me make my dragons. For a moment, as he shook her hand, he was sure the dice had stopped. But a heartbeat later, they were rattling again. It must have been imagination. After all, this agreement with Aludra might help the band, and incidentally Matt Cawthon stay alive, yet it could hardly be called faithful. He would still have to fight those battles, and however you planned, however well-trained your men were, luck played its part too, bad as well as good even for him. These dragons would not change that. But were the dice bouncing as loudly? He thought not. Yet how could he be sure? Never before had they slowed without stopping. It had to be his imagination. A hollow thump came from inside the enclosure, and acrid smoke billowed over the canvas wall. Moments later, the night flower bloomed in the darkness above Runyon Crossing, a great ball of red and green streaks. It bloomed again and again in his dreams that night, and for many nights after. But there it bloomed among charging horses and massed pikes, rending flesh as he had once seen stone rent by fireworks. In his dreams, he tried to catch the things with his hands, tried to stop them, yet they rained down in unending streams on 100 battlefields. In his dreams, he wept for the death and destruction. And somehow it seemed that the rattling of the dice in his head sounded like laughter. Not his laughter, the Dark One's laughter. The next morning, with the sun just rising toward him, he was sitting on the steps of the careful scraping at the bow stave with a sharp knife. Careful, almost a careless slice could ruin your work. Ian and Doman came out. Strangely, they seemed to have dressed with special care, in their best, such as it was. He was not the only one to have bought cloth and Girodor, but without promises of Matt's gold to speed them, the seamstresses were still sewing for Doman and Agenan. The blue-eyed Shan woman wore a bright green dress heavily embroidered with tiny white and yellow flowers on the high neck and all down the sleeves. A flowered scarf held her long black wig in place. Doman, odd with a head of very short hair and that Ileonar beard that left his upper lip bare, had brushed his worn brown coat till it actually had some semblance of neatness. They squeezed past Matt and hurried off without a word, and he thought no more of it until they returned an hour or so later to announce that they had been into the village. Mother Garvale. He could not stop himself from gaping. Eginen's stern face and sharp eyes gave good indications of her character. What could have brought Doman to marry the woman? As soon marry a bear. Realizing the Ileonar was beginning to glare at him, he hastily got to his feet and made a presentable bow over the bowstave. Congratulations, Master Doman. Congratulations, Mistress Doman. The light shone on you both. Easy to say. Doman kept glaring at him as if he had heard Matt's thoughts, though, and Eginen snorted. My name is Lywin Shipless Cawthon, she drawled. That's the name I was given, and the name I'll die with. And a good name it is, since it helped me reach a decision I should have made weeks ago. Frowning, she looked sideways at Doman. You do understand why I could not take your name, don't you, Bale? No, lass, Doman replied gently, resting a thick hand on her shoulder. But I will take you with any name you do care to use, so long as you do be my wife. I told you that. She smiled and laid her hand atop his, and he began smiling too. Light, but the pair of them were sickening. If marriage made a man start smiling like dreamy syrup, well, not Matt Cawthon. He might be as good as wed, but Matt Cawthon was never going to start carrying on like a loon. And that was how he ended up in a green-striped wall tent, not very large, that belonged to a pair of lean Domani brothers who ate fire and swallowed swords. Even Tom admitted that Ballat and Abar were good, and they were popular with the other performers, so finding them places to stay was easy. But that tent cost as much as the wagon had. Everybody knew he had gold to fling about, and that pair just sighed over giving up their snug home when he tried to bargain them down. Well, a new bride and groom needed privacy, and he was more than glad to give it to them, if it meant he did not have to watch them go moon-eyed at each other. Besides, he was tired of taking his turn sleeping on the floor. In the tent, at least, he had his own cot every night. Narrow and hard it might be, yet it was softer than floorboards. And with only him, he had more room than in the wagon, even after the rest of his clothes were moved in, and stowed in a pair of brass-bound chests. He had a washstand of his very own, a ladder-backed chair that was not too unsteady, a sturdy stool, and a table big enough to hold the plate and cup and a pair of decent brass lamps. The chest of gold he left in the green wagon. Only a blind fool would try robbing Doman. Only a madman would try robbing Eginen. Lywin, if she insisted, though he was still certain she would regain her senses eventually. After the first night, spent close by the Aes Sedai wagon with the Foxhead cool for half the night, he had the tent set up facing Tuon's wagon by dint of making sure that the Red Arms started raising it before anyone else could claim the space. Are you placing yourself as my guard now? Tuon said coolly when she saw the tent for the first time. No, he replied. I'm just hoping for more glimpses of you. That was the light's own truth. Well, getting away from the Aes Sedai was part of it, but the other was true too. Yet the woman waggled her fingers at Selucia, and the pair of them launched into gales of giggles before recovering themselves and re-entering the faded purple wagon with all the dignity of a royal procession. Women. He was not often alone in the tent. He had taken on Lopen as his body servant after Nelisian's death, and the stout tyrant with his blocky face and a beard that nearly reached his chest was always popping in to bow his balding head and ask what my lord would enjoy for his next meal, or inquire whether my lord had any need of wine or tea, or would care for a plate of candied dried figs he had vaguely acquired somewhere. Lopen was vain over his ability to find delicacies where it seemed there could be none. That, or he was rifling through the clothes chests to see whether anything needed repair or cleaning or ironing. Something always did, in his estimation, though it all looked fine to Matt. Narim, Talmanis's melancholy body servant, frequently accompanied him, largely because the skinny gray-haired Arianan was bored. Matt could not understand how anyone could get bored with not having any work to do. But Joel dolorous comments on how poorly Telmanus must be faring without him, mournfully sighing about 5 times a day that Telmanus must have given his place to another by now, and he was ready to wrestle Lopin, if need be, for a share of the cleaning and mending. He even wanted his turn blacking Matt's boots. Noel dropped by to spin his tall tails and Oliver to play stones or snakes and foxes when he was not playing with Tuon instead. Tom came to play stones too, and to share rumors he picked up in the towns and villages, knuckling his long white mustaches over the choicer bits. Julian brought his own reports, but he always brought Amathera as well. The former Panarch of Terrebonne was pretty enough for Matt to understand why the thief-catcher was interested, with a rosebud mouth just made for kissing, and she clung to Julian's arm as if she might return some of his feelings, but her big eyes always gazed fearfully toward Tuon's wagon, even when they were all inside Matt's tent. And it was still all Julian could do to keep her from dropping to her knees and putting her face to the ground whenever she glimpsed Tuon or Selucia. She did the same with Aeginan, and with Bethamin and Sita besides. Considering that Amathera had been Dakovale for just a matter of months, it fair made Matt's skin crawl. Tuon could not really mean to make him Dakovale when she was going to marry him, could she? He soon told them to stop bringing him rumors about Rand. Fighting the colors in his head was too much effort, and he lost that fight as often as he won. Sometimes it was all right, but sometimes he caught glimpses of Rand and Min, and it seemed those two were carrying on something awful. Anyway, the rumors were all the same, really. The Dragon Reborn was dead, killed by Aes Sedai, by Ashaman, by the Seanchan, by a dozen other assassins. No, he was in hiding. He was massing a secret army. He was doing some fool thing or other that varied village by village and usually inn by inn. The one thing that was clear was that Rand was no longer in Cairhien, and nobody had any idea where he was. The Dragon Reborn had vanished. It was odd how many of these Altaran farmers and villagers and townsfolk seemed worried by that, as worried as the merchants passing through and the men and women who worked for them. Not one of those people knew any more of the Dragon Reborn than the tales they carried, yet his disappearance frightened them. Tom and Julian were clear on that until he made them stop. If the Dragon Reborn was dead, what was the world to do? That was the question that people asked over breakfast in the morning and ale in the evening and likely on going to bed. Matt could have told them Rand was alive. His bloody visions made him sure of that. But explaining how he knew was another matter. Even Tom and Julian seemed uncertain about the colors. The merchants and the others would have thought him a madman, and if they believed, that would only scatter rumors about him, not to mention likely setting the Seanchan to hunting for him. All he wanted was the bloody colors out of his head. Moving into the tent made the showfolk eye him very oddly, and small wonder. First, he had been running off with Aeginan, Lyle-Win if she insisted on it, and Billman supposedly was her servant. But now she was with Billman, and Matt was out of the wagon entirely. Some of the showfolk seemed to think it no more than he deserved for trailing after Tuon, yet a surprising number offered him sympathy. Several men commiserated over the fickleness of women, at least they did when there were no women around, and some of the unmarried women, contortionists and acrobats and seamstresses, began eyeing him much too warmly. He might have enjoyed that if they had not been so willing to give him smoky looks right in front of Tuon. The first time that happened, he was so startled that his eyes nearly popped. Tuon seemed to find it amusing, of all things. She seemed to. But only a fool thought he knew what was in a woman's head just because she had a smile on her face. He continued to dine with her every midday, if they were halted, and began arriving for his nightly games of stones early, so she had to feed him then, too. Life's truth, if you got a woman to feed you on a regular basis, she was halfway won. At least he dined with her when she would let him into the wagon. One night he found the latch down, and no amount of talking would make her or Selucia open the door. It seemed a bird had managed to get inside during the day, an extremely bad omen apparently, and the pair of them had to spend the night in prayer and contemplation to avert some evil or other. They seemed to run half their lives according to superstitions. Tuon or Selucia would make odd signs with their hands if they saw a web with the spider in it. And Tuan explained to him, just as serious as if she were making sense, that the sure result of clearing away a spider web before shooing the spider out of it was the death of someone close to you within the month. They would see a flight of birds circle more than once and predict a storm, or draw a finger through a line of marching ants, count how long it took for the ants to rejoin their line, and predict how many days of fair weather lay ahead. And never mind that it did not work out that way. Oh, there was rain 3 days after the birds, crows, disturbingly enough, and it was nowhere near a storm, just a gray, drizzling day. Obviously, Salusha miscounted with the ants, Tuan said, placing a white stone on the board with that oddly graceful arching of her fingers. Salusha, watching over her shoulder in a white blouse and divided brown skirts, nodded. As usual, she wore a headscarf over her short golden hair, even indoors, a length of red and gold silk that day. Tuan was all in brocaded blue silk, a coat of odd cut that covered her hips, and divided skirts so narrow they seemed to be wide trousers. She spent considerable time giving the seamstresses detailed instructions on what she wanted sewn, and little of it was much like anything he had ever seen before. It was all in Sean Chan styles, he suspected, though she had had a few riding dresses sewn that would not draw comment for when she went outside. Rain pattered softly on the roof of the wagon. Obviously, what the birds told us was modified by the ants. It is never simple, Toy. You must learn these things. I will not have you ignorant. Matt nodded as if that made sense and placed his black stone. And she called his uneasiness about crows and ravens superstition. Knowing when to keep your mouth shut was a useful skill around women. Around men, too, but more so around women. You could be pretty certain what would set a man's eyes on fire. Talking with her could be dangerous in other ways, too. What do you know of the Dragon Reborn? She asked him another evening. He choked on a mouthful of wine, and the whirling colors in his brain dissipated in a fit of coughing. The wine was near enough vinegar, but even Nerim had a hard time finding good wine these days. Well, he's the Dragon Reborn, he said, when he could speak, wiping wine from his chin with one hand. For a moment he saw Rand eating at a large, dark table. What else is there to know? Salusha refilled his cup smoothly. A great deal, Toy. For one thing, he must kneel to the crystal throne of Tarmangaiden. The prophecies are clear on that. But I haven't even been able to learn where he is. It becomes still more urgent if he is the one who sounded the Horn of Valir, as I suspect. The Horn of Valir? He said weakly. The prophecy said what? It's been found, then? It must have been, mustn't it, if it was sounded, she drawled dryly. The reports I've seen from the place where it was blown, a place called Falma, are very disturbing. Very disturbing. Securing whoever blew the horn, man or woman, may be as important as securing the Dragon Reborn himself. Are you going to play a stone or not, Toy? He played his stone, but he was so shaken that the colors whirled and faded without forming any image. In fact, he was barely able to eke out a draw from what had seemed a clear winning position. You played very poorly toward the end, Tuan murmured, frowning thoughtfully at the board, now divided evenly between the control of black stones and white. He could all but see her start trying to work out what they had been talking about when his poor play began. Talking with her was like walking a crumbling ledge across the face of a cliff. One misstep and Matt Coffin would be as dead as last year's mutton. Only he had to walk that ledge. He had no bloody choice. Oh, he enjoyed it in her way. The longer he spent with her, the more opportunity to memorize that heart-shaped face, to get it down so he could see her just by closing his eyes. But there was always that misstep waiting ahead. He could almost see that, too. For several days after giving her the little bunch of silk flowers, he brought her no presents, and he thought he was beginning to detect hints of disappointment when he appeared empty-handed. Then, 4 days out of Jirador, just as the sun was peeking over the horizon into a nearly cloudless sky, he got her and Salusha out of the purple wagon. Well, he just wanted Tuan, but Salusha might as well have been her shadow when it came to trying to separate them. He had commented on that once, making a joke, and both women went on talking as if he had not spoken. It was a good thing he knew Tuan could laugh at a joke, because sometimes she seemed to have no sense of humor at all. So Lucia, wrapped in a green wool cloak, with the cowl all but hiding her red headscarf, eyed him suspiciously, but then she nearly always did. Tuan never bothered with the scarf, yet the shortness of her black hair was not so apparent with the hood of her blue cloak up. "Cover your eyes, precious," he said. "I have a surprise for you." "I like surprises," she replied, placing her hands over her big eyes. For an instant she smiled in anticipation, but only for an instant. "Some surprises, Toy." That had the sound of a warning. So Lucia stood hard by her shoulder, and though the bosomy woman appeared completely at her ease, something told him she was as tense as a cat ready to leap. He suspected she did not like surprises. "Wait right there," he said, and ducked around the side of the purple wagon. When he returned, he was leading Pips and the Razor, both saddled and bridled. The mare stepped lively, frisking at the prospect of an outing. "You can look now. I thought you might like a ride." They had hours. The show might as well have been deserted for all the evidence of life among the wagons. Only a handful had smoke rising from their metal chimneys. "She's yours," he added, and stiffened as the words nearly froze in his throat. There was no doubt this time. He had said the horse was hers, and suddenly the dice were not beating so loudly in his head. It was not that they had slowed, he was sure of that. There had been more than one set rattling away. One had stopped when he made his agreement with Aludra, and another when he told Tuan the horse was hers. That was odd in itself. How could giving her a horse be fateful for him? But light, it had been bad enough when he had to worry about one set of dice giving warning at a time. How many sets were still bouncing off the inside of his skull? How many more fateful moments were waiting to crash down on him? Tuan went immediately to the Razor, all smiles, as she examined the animal as thoroughly as he had himself. She did train horses for fun, after all. Horses and Damani, the light held him. So Lucia was studying him, he realized, her expression an expressionless mask. Because of the horse, or because he had gone stiff as a post? "She's a Razor," he said, patting Pips's blunt nose. The gelding had been getting plenty of exercise, but the Razor's eagerness seemed to have infected him. "Damani bloodborne favor Razors, and it's not likely you'll ever see one outside of Eridaman." "What will you name her?" "It is bad luck to name a horse before riding it," Tuan replied, taking the reins. She was still beaming. Her big eyes shone. "She's a very fine animal, Toy. A wonderful gift. Either you have a good eye, or you were very lucky." "I have a good eye, precious," he said warily. She seemed more delighted than even the Razor called for. "If you say so. Where is Salusha's mount?" Oh, well. It had been worth a try. A smart man hedged his bets, though, so a sharp whistle brought Metwin at a trot, leading a saddled dapple. Matt ignored the wide grin that split the man's pale face. The Kyrian and Redon had been sure he would not get away with leaving Salusha behind, but there was no need to smirk over it. Matt judged the dapple gelding, 10 years old, to be gentle enough for Salusha. In his memory, ladies' maids seldom were more than tolerable riders, but the woman gave the animal a going-over as complete as Tuan's. And when she was done, she directed a look at Matt that said she would ride the horse so as not to make a bother, but she found it decidedly lacking. Women could compress a great deal into one look. Once clear of the field where the show was camped, Tuan walked the Razor along the road for a time, then took her to a trot, and then a canter. The surface was hard-packed yellow clay here, studded with edges of old paving stones. No trouble for a well-shod horse, though, and he had made sure of the Razor's shoes. Matt kept Pips even with Tuan, as much for the pleasure of watching her smile as anything else. When Tuan was enjoying herself, the stern judge was forgotten, and pure delight shone on her face. Not that watching her was easy, since Salusha had the dapple between them. The yellow-haired woman was a formidable chaperone, and by the sidelong glances she gave him, her small smiles, she very much enjoyed the job of frustrating him. At the start, they had the road to themselves, except for a few farm carts, but after After a while, a tinker caravan appeared ahead of them, a line of garishly painted and lacquered wagons rolling slowly southward down the other side of the road with massive dogs trotting alongside. Those dogs were the only real protection Tinkers had. The driver of the lead wagon, as red as Luca's coats, trimmed in yellow and with violent green and yellow wheels to boot, half stood to peer toward Matt, then sat back down and said something to the woman beside him, doubtless reassured by the presence of the two women with Matt. Tinkers were a cautious lot of necessity. That whole caravan would whittle up their horses and flee a single man they thought meant harm. Matt nodded to the fellow as the wagons began to pass. The lean, gray-haired man's high-collared coat was as green as his wagon's wheels, and his wife's dress was striped in shades of blue, most bright enough to suit any of the show's performers. The gray-haired man raised his hand in a wave, and Tuan suddenly turned the razor and galloped into the trees, cloak streaming out behind her. In a flash, Solutia had the dapple darting after her. Snatching his hat off so as not to lose it, Matt wheeled Pips and followed. Shouts rose from the wagons, but he paid them no mind. His attention was all on Tuan. He wished he knew what she was up to. Not escape, he was sure. Likely she was just trying to make him tear out his hair. If so, she was in a fair way for succeeding. Pips quickly reeled in the dapple and left a scowling Solutia behind, flailing her mount with the reins. But Tuan and the razor kept their lead as the rolling land climbed toward hills. Startled flights of birds sprang up from beneath both animals' hooves. Coveys of gray dove and of brown-speckled quail, sometimes ruffed brown grouse. All disaster needed was for the mare to be frightened by one of those. The best trained mount could rear and fall when a bird burst up underhoof. Worse, Tuan rode like a madwoman, never slowing, only swerving from her line, where the underbrush lay dense, leaping trees toppled by old storms as if she had a clue what lay on the other side. Well, he had to ride like a madman himself to keep up, though he winced every time he set Pips to jump a tree trunk. Some were near as thick as he was tall. He dug his boot heels into the gelding's flanks, urging more speed, though he knew Pips was running as hard as he ever had. He had chosen too well in that bloody razor. Up and up they raced through the forest. As abruptly as she had begun her mad dash, Tuan reined in, well over a mile from the road. The trees were old here and widely spaced, black pines 40 paces tall and wide-spreading oaks with branches that arched down to touch the ground before rising again, and could have been sliced crosswise into tables to seat a dozen in comfort. Thick creepers shrouded half-buried boulders and stone outcrops, but aside from that, only a few weeds pushed through the mulch. Oaks that size killed off any lesser undergrowth beneath them. "Your animal is better than he looks," the fool woman said, patting her mount's neck when he reached her. Oh, she was all innocence, just out for a pleasant ride. "Maybe you do have a good eye." With the cowl of her cloak fallen down her back, her cap of short hair was visible, glistening like black silk. He suppressed a desire to stroke it. "Burn how good my eye is," he growled, clapping his hat on. He knew he should speak smoothly, but he could not have taken the roughness from his voice with a file. "Do you always ride like a moon-blinded idiot? You could have broken that mare's neck before she even got a name. Worse, you could have broken your own. I promised to get you home safely, and I mean to do just that. If you're going to risk killing yourself every time you go riding, then I won't let you ride." He wished he had those last words back as soon as they left his tongue. A man might laugh off a threat like that as a joke, maybe, if he were lucky. But a woman? Now all he could do was wait for the explosion. He expected Eludra's night flowers to pale by comparison. She raised the hood of her cloak, settling it just so. She studied him. Finally, she nodded to herself. "I name her Arcane. That means swallow." Matt blinked. That was it? No eruption? "I know. A good name. It suits her." What was she about now? The woman almost never did or said what he expected. "What is this place, Toy?" she said, frowning at the trees. "Or should I say, what was it? Do you know?" What did she mean? What was this place? It was a bloody forest, was what it was. But suddenly, what had seemed a large boulder right in front of him, nearly obscured by thick vines, resolved into a huge stone head, slightly tilted to one side. A woman's head, he thought. Those smooth rondelles were probably meant for jewels in her hair. The statue it sat on must have been immense. A full span of the thing showed, yet only her eyes and the top of her head were out of the ground. And that long white stone outcrop with an oak tree's roots growing over it was a piece of a spiral column. All around them now he could make out bits of columns and large worked stones that plainly had been part of some grand structure, and what had to be a stone sword 2 spans long, all half buried. Still, ruins of cities and monuments could be found in many places, and few even among Aes Sedai had any idea what they had been. Opening his mouth to say that he did not know, he caught sight through the trees of 3 tall hills in a row, perhaps another mile on. The middle hill had a cleft top, like a wedge cut cleanly out, while the hill on the left had 2. And he knew. There could hardly be 3 hills exactly like that anywhere else. Those hills had been called the Dancers when this place had been Londaran Kor, the capital city of Aeharon. The road behind them had been paved then and ran through the heart of the city, which had sprawled for miles. People had said that the artistry in stone that the Ogier had practiced in Tar Valon they had perfected in Londaran Kor. Of course, the people of every Ogier-built city had claimed their own outdid Tar Valon, confirming Tar Valon as the touchstone. He had a number of memories of the city, dancing at a ball in the Palace of the Moon, carousing in soldiers' taverns where veiled dancers writhed, watching the procession of flutes during the blessing of the swords. But oddly, he had another memory of those hills, from near enough 500 years after the Trollocs left no stone standing in Londaran Kor, and Aeharon died in blood and fire. Why it had been necessary for Naravan and Isandara to invade Chiota, as the land was then, he did not know. Those old memories were fragments, however long a time anyone covered, and full of gaps. He had no idea why those hills had been called the Dancers either, or what the blessing of the swords was. But he remembered being an Essendarn lord in a battle fought among these ruins. He remembered having those hills in view when he took an arrow through his throat. He must have fallen no more than half a mile from the very spot where he sat Pips, drowning in his own blood. Like I hate to remember dying, he thought. And the thought turned to a coal burning in his brain, a coal that burned hotter and hotter. He remembered those men's deaths, not just one, but dozens of them. He remembered dying. Toy, are you ill? Tuan brought the mare close and peered up into his face. Concern filled her big eyes. You've gone pale as the moon. I'm right as spring water, he muttered. She was close enough for him to kiss if he bent his head, but he did not move. He could not. He was thinking so furiously he had nothing left for motion. Somehow, only the light knew, the eelfin had gathered the memories they had planted in his head. How could they harvest memory from a corpse? A corpse in the world of men, at that. He was certain they never came to this side of that twisted door-framed Tirangreal for longer than minutes at a time. A way occurred to him, one he did not like, not a scrap. Maybe they created some sort of link to any human who visited them, a link that allowed them to copy all of a man's memories after that, right up to the moment he died. In some of those memories from other men, he was white-haired. In some, only a few years older than he really was, and everything in between. But there were none of childhood or growing up. What were the odds of that, if they had just stuffed him with random bits and pieces, likely things they considered rubbish or had done with? What did they do with memories anyway? They had to have some reason for gathering them beyond giving them away again. No, he was just trying to avoid where this led. Burn him. The bloody foxes were inside his head right then. They had to be. It was the only explanation that made sense. Well, you look as if you're about to vomit it, Tuan said, backing the razor away with a grimace. Who in the show would have herbs? I have some knowledge there. I'm all right, I tell you. In truth, he did want to sick up. Having those foxes in his head was 1,000 times worse than the dice, however hard the dice rattled. could the eel fin see through his eyes? Like, what was he going to do? He doubted any Aes Sedai could heal him of this, not that he would trust them to, not when it meant leaving off the foxhead. There was nothing to be done. He would just have to live with it. He groaned at the thought. Cantering up to them, Selucia gave him and Tuon each a quick look, as if considering what they might have been up to in their time alone. But then she had taken her time in catching up, giving them that time. That was hopeful. "Next time you can ride this gentle creature, and I will ride your gelding," she told Matt. "High lady, people from those wagons are following us with dogs. They're afoot, but they will be here soon. The dogs don't bark." "Trained guard dogs, then," Tuon said, gathering her reins.
I'll be right back, everyone.
We can avoid them easily enough." "No need to try and no use," Matt told her. He should have expected this. "Those people are tinkers, Tuathalan, and they're no danger to anybody. They couldn't be violent if their lives depended on it. That's no exaggeration, just simple truth. But they saw you two go herring off trying to get away from me, as it must have seemed, and me chasing after. Now that those dogs have a scent trail, the Tinkers will follow us all the way back to the show if need be to make sure you two haven't been kidnapped or harmed. We'll go meet them to save the time and trouble." It was not the Tinkers' time he cared about. Luca probably would not care one way or the other if a bunch of Tinkers getting in the way delayed the show setting out, but Matt certainly would. Selucia scowled at him indignantly, and her fingers flew, but Tuon laughed. "Toy wishes to be commanding today, Selucia. I will let him command and see how he does." Bloody kind of her. They trotted back the way they had come, riding around the fallen trees this time, though now and then Tuon would gather her reins as if she meant to jump one, then give Matt a mischievous grin. And it was not long before the Tinkers came into sight, running through the trees behind their huge mastiffs, like a flight of butterflies. 50 or so men and women in bright colors, often in jarring combinations. A man might be wearing a red and blue striped coat and baggy yellow trousers tucked into knee boots, or a violet-colored coat above red trousers, or worse. Some women wore dresses striped in as many colors as there were colors, and even colors Matt had no name for, while others wore skirts and blouses as varied in hue and as clashing as the men's coats and trousers. A fair number had shawls as well, to add more colors to the eye-scrambling blend. Except for the gray-haired man who had been driving the lead wagon, they all appeared to be short of their middle years. He must be the Seeker, the leader of the caravan. Matt dismounted, and after a moment Tuon and Selucia did too. The Tinkers stopped at that, calling their dogs to heel. The big animals slumped to the ground, tongues lolling out, and the people came on more slowly. None carried so much as a stick, and though Matt wore no weapons that showed, they eyed him warily. The men clustered in front of him, while the women gathered around Tuon and Selucia. There was no threat in it, but as easily as that, Tuon and Selucia were separated from him, off where the Tinker women could make inquiries. Suddenly it occurred to him that Tuon might think it a fine game to claim he was trying to bother her. She and Selucia could ride off while he was trying to contend with Tinkers crowding around him in pips, so he could not climb into the saddle. That was all they would do, but unless he was willing to fight his way clear, they might keep him here for hours, maybe, to give that pair time to escape. The gray-haired man bowed with his hands pressed to his chest. "Peace be on you and yours, my lord. Forgiveness if we intrude, but we feared our dogs had frightened the lady's horses." Matt responded with a bow in the same fashion. "Peace be on you always, Seeker, and on all the people. The lady's horses weren't frightened. The ladies are impetuous at times." What were the women saying? He tried to eavesdrop, but their voices were low murmurs. "You know something of the people, my lord?" The Seeker sounded surprised, and had a right to. The Tuathalan kept away from anywhere larger than a moderate-sized village. They would seldom encounter anyone in a silk coat. "Only a little," Matt replied. A very little. He had memories of meeting Tinkers, but he himself had never spoken to one before. What were those bloody women saying? "Will you answer me a question? I've seen a number of your caravans the past few days. more than I'd have expected to. And all heading toward Abu Dar. Is there a reason? The man hesitated, darting a glance toward the women. They were still murmuring away, and he had to be wondering why their conversation was lasting so long. After all, it only needed a moment to say, yes, I need help, or the opposite. It is the people called Shan-Chan, my lord, he said finally. Word is spreading among the people that there is safety where the Shan-Chan rule, and equal justice for all. Elsewhere, you understand, my lord. Matt did. Like the showfolk, tinkers were strangers wherever they went, and worse, strangers with an undeserved reputation for thievery. Well, they stole no more often than anyone else, and a deserved one for trying to entice young people into joining them. And on top of it, for tinkers, there was no question of fighting back if anybody tried to rob them or chase them away. Take care, Seeker. Their safety comes at a price, and some of their laws are harsh. You know what they do with women who can channel? Thank you for your concern, my lord, the man said calmly. But few of our women ever begin channeling, and if one does, we will do as we always do, and take her to Tarvalon. Abruptly, the women began laughing. Great gales and peals. The seeker relaxed visibly. If the women were laughing, Matt was not the kind of man who would strike them down or kill them for getting in his way. For Matt's part, he scowled. There was nothing in that laughter that he liked. The tinkers made their departure with more apologies from the seeker for having bothered them, but the women kept looking back and laughing behind cupped hands. Some of the men leaned close as they walked, plainly asking questions, but the women just shook their heads and looked back again, laughing. What did you tell them? Matt asked sourly. Oh, that's none of your business, now is it, Toy? Tuan replied, and Selusha laughed. Oh, she bloody cackled, she did. He decided he was better off not knowing. Women just purely enjoyed planting needles in a man. Chapter 9. A Short Path. Tuan and Selusha were not the only women who caused Matt trouble, of course. Sometimes it seemed that most of the trouble in his life came from women, which he could not understand at all, since he always tried to treat them well. Even Aginin gave her share of grief, though it was the smallest share. I was right. You do think you can marry her, she drawled when he asked her for help with Tuan. She and Doman were seated on the steps of their wagon with their arms around each other. A trickle of smoke rose from Doman's pipe. It was mid-morning on a fine day, though gathering clouds threatened rain for later, and the performers were putting on their acts for the inhabitants of 4 small villages that combined perhaps equaled Runnian Crossing in size. Matt had no desire to go watch, though he still enjoyed watching the contortionists, and better still the female acrobats and tumblers, but when you saw jugglers and fire-eaters and the like every day just about, even Mayora and her leopards became, well, less interesting, if not exactly ordinary. Never you mind what I think, Aginin. Will you tell me what you know of her? Trying to find out from her is like fishing blindfolded and barehanded in a briar patch trying to catch a rabbit. My name is Lylewin Cotton. Don't forget it again, she said in tones suitable for giving orders on a ship's deck. Her eyes tried to drive the command home like blue hammers. Why should I help you? You aim too high above yourself, a mole yearning for the sun. You could face execution for simply saying you want to marry her. It's disgusting. Besides, I've left all that behind me. Or it's left me, she added bitterly. Doman gave her a one-armed hug. If you've left all that behind you, what do you care how disgusting my wanting to marry her is? There, it was out in the open. Partly, at least. Doman removed the pipe from his mouth long enough to blow a smoke ring aimed at Matt's face. If she doesn't want to help you, then give over. He gave it that same ship's deck voice of command. Aginin muttered under her breath. She appeared to be arguing with herself. Finally, she shook her head. No, Bale, he's right. If I'm cast adrift, then I have to find a new ship and a new course. I can never return to Shan-Chan, so I might as well cut the cable and be done with it. What she knew of Tuan was mainly rumor. It seemed the imperial family lived their lives behind walls even when in plain sight, and only whispers of what went on behind those walls escaped. Yet those were sufficient to make the hair on the back of Matt's neck stand up. His wife-to-be had had a brother and a sister assassinated? After they tried to have her killed, true, but still. What kind of family went around killing one another? The Shonshan blood and the imperial family, for starters. Half of her siblings were dead, assassinated, most of them, and maybe the others too. Some of what Againin, Lyle Wynn, had to tell was generally known among Shan-Chan, and hardly more comforting. Tuan would have been schooled in intrigue from infancy, schooled in weapons and fighting with her bare hands, heavily guarded, yet expected to be her own last line of defense. All of those born to the blood were taught to dissemble, to disguise their intentions and ambitions. Power shifted constantly among the blood, some climbing higher, others slipping down. The dance was only faster and more dangerous in the imperial family. The Empress, she started to add, may she live forever, and half choked in swallowing the words, then closed her eyes for a long moment before continuing. The Empress had borne many children, as every Empress did, so that among those who survived there would be one fit to rule after her. It would not do to have someone who was stupid or a fool ascend the crystal throne. Tuan was accounted very far from either. Light. The woman he was to marry was as bad as water and Aes Sedai wrapped into one, and maybe as dangerous. He had several conversations with Againin. He was careful to name her Lyle when to her face, lest she go for him with her dagger. Yet he thought of her as Againin, trying to learn more, but her knowledge of the blood was largely from the outside looking in, and her knowledge of the imperial court, by her own admission, little better than that of a street urchin in Chandar. The day he gave Tuan the mare, he had ridden alongside Againin's wagon, having one of those fruitless conversations. He had accompanied Tuan and Solution for a time, but they kept looking at him sideways, then exchanging glances and giggling, over what they had told the tinkerwomen without a sliver of doubt. A man could only take so much of that sort of thing. A clever gift, that mare, Againin said, leaning out from the driver's seat to look up the line of wagons. Doman was handling the reins. She took her turn sometimes, but handling a team was not among the skills she had learned on ships. How did you know? Know what? He asked. She straightened and adjusted her wig. He did not know why she continued to wear the thing. Her own black hair was short, but no shorter than Solution's. About courting gifts. Among the blood, when you are courting someone higher than you, a traditional gift is something exotic or rare. Best of all is if you can connect the gift somehow to one of the recipient's pleasures, and it's well known the High Lady loves horses. It's good you've acknowledged that you don't expect to be her equal, too. Not that this is going to work, you understand. I don't have a clue why she's still here. Now you've stopped guarding her, but you can't believe she'll actually say the words. When she marries, it will be for the good of the Empire, not because some layabout like you gave her a horse or made her smile. Matt ground his teeth to keep from shouting a curse. He had acknowledged what? No wonder a set of bloody dice had stopped. Tuan would let him forget this when it snowed on Sunday. He was certain sure of that. If Lyle went bloody shipless gave him small griefs, the Aes Sedai managed larger. Aes Sedai liked nothing better. He was resigned to them traipsing about every village and town they stopped at, asking questions and doing the light knew what else. He had no choice but resignation, with no way to stop them. They claimed to be taking care. At least Teslin and Edicina did. Jolene snapped that he was a fool for worrying. Yet an Aes Sedai taking care was still clearly a woman of consequence, whether or not anybody recognized what she was. Lacking the coin for silks, they had purchased bolts of fine wool in Jurador, and the seamstresses worked as hard for Aes Sedai as they did for Matt's gold, so they strolled about dressed like wealthy merchants and as sure of themselves as any noble ever born. Nobody saw one of them walk 5 strides without knowing that she expected the world to conform itself to her. 3 women like that, with a traveling show at that, were sure to cause talk. At least Jolene left her great serpent ring in her belt pouch. The other 2 had lost theirs to the Shanchan. If Matt had seen Jolene with the thing actually on her finger, he thought he would have wept. He got no more reports on their activities than the former Suldan. Jolene firmly in hand. The tall dog ran when Jolene said fun and jumped when she said toad. Edicina was giving her lessons too. She considered Bethamin a personal project for some reason. She was never harsh, that Matt saw, not after the face slapping, but you might have thought she was getting Bethamin ready to go to the tower. Bethamin returned a sort of gratitude that made it clear her loyalties had shifted. As for
Second,
Sita,
everyone. I'll be
the
right back.
woman was so frightened of the sisters that she did not dare follow them any longer. She actually shivered when he suggested it. Strange as it seemed, Sita and Bethamin had been so accustomed to how Shanchan women who could channel saw themselves that they had really believed Aes Sedai could not be much different. They were dangerous when off the leash, yet dangerous dogs could be handled by someone who knew how, and they were experts with that particular sort of dangerous dog. Now they knew that Aes Sedai were not dogs of any kind. They were wolves. Sita would have found another place to sleep had that been possible, and he learned from Mistress Annan that the Shanchan woman put her hands over her eyes whenever Jolene or Edicina was teaching Bethamin in the wagon. I'm certain she can see the weaves, Satala said. He would have said she sounded envious, except that he doubted she envied anyone. She's halfway to admitting it, or she wouldn't hide her eyes. Soon or late, she'll come around and want to learn too. Maybe she did sound envious at that. He could have wished for Sita to come around soon rather than late. Another student would have left the Aes Sedai less time to trouble him. If the show was halted, he could hardly turn around without seeing Jolene or Edicina peering around the corner of a tent or wagon at him. Usually the fox head cooled on his chest. He could not prove they were actually channeling at him, yet he was certain of it. He was unsure which of them found the loophole in his protection that Adelius and Van Dien had, that something thrown with the power would hit him, but after that he could barely leave his tent without getting hit by a rock, and later by other things, burning sparks like a shower from a forge fire, stinging sparks that made him leap and his hair try to stand on end. He was positive that Jolene was behind it. If for no other reason, he never saw her without Blerick and Fen, or both, nearby for protection. And she smiled at him like a cat smiling at a mouse. He was planning how to get her alone. It was that or spend his time hiding from her. When she and Teslin got into a shouting match that cleared Edicina out of the whitewashed wagon almost as quickly as Bethamin and Sita. And those 2 ran out and stood gaping at the wagon. The yellow sister calmly went back to brushing her long black hair, lifting it up with one hand and sweeping the wooden hairbrush down it with the other. Seeing Matt, she smiled at him without ceasing the motions of her brush. The medallion went cold, and the shouting vanished as though cut off by a knife. He never learned what was behind that power-woven shield. Teslin favored him somewhat, yet when he asked her, she gave him one of those looks in silence. It was Aes Sedai business and none of his. Whatever had gone on in there, though, the rocks stopped and the sparks. He tried thanking Teslin, but she was having none of it. When it be no to be spoken of, it be no to be spoken of, she told him firmly. It would be well for you to learn that lesson if you are to be around sisters. And I think your life be tied to Aes Sedai, now if it was no before. Bloody thing for her to say. She never cracked her teeth about his tirangriel, but the same could not be said of Jolene and Edicina, even after the argument. They tried to bully him into handing it over every single day. Edicina cornering him by herself, Jolene with her warders glowering over her shoulders at him. tirangriel were rightfully the property of the White Tower. tirangriel needed proper study, particularly one with the odd properties this one possessed. tirangriel were potentially dangerous, too much so to be left in the hands of the uninitiated. Neither said especially a man's hands, but Jolene came close. He began to worry that the Green would have Blerick and Fenn simply take it from him. That pair still suspected he had been involved in what had happened to her, and the dark looks they gave him said they wanted any excuse to beat him like a drum. That would be stealing, Mistress Anand told them in a lecturing tone, gathering a cloak around her. The sunlight was beginning to fade, and coolness already setting in. They were standing outside Tuon's wagon, and he was hoping to get inside in time to be fed. Noel and Olver were already inside. Satala was apparently off to visit the Aes Sedai, something she did frequently. Tower law is quite clear on that. There might be considerable discussion over whether it had to be given back to you. I rather think it would not be, in the end. But Jolene would face a fairly harsh penance for theft all the same. Maybe she'd think it worth a penance, he muttered. His stomach rumbled. The pot of finches and green vegetables presented proudly for his meal had both turned out to be spoiled. The tyrant's extreme mortification, which meant Matt had eaten bread since breakfast and no more. You know an awful lot about the White Tower. What I know, Lord Matt, is that you've made just about every misstep a man can make with Aes Sedai, short of trying to kill one. The reason I came with you in the first place, instead of going with my husband, half the reason I'm still here, is to try to keep too many missteps. I don't know why I should care. I do, and that's that. If you would let yourself be guided by me, you'd not be in trouble with them now. I can't say how much I can recover for you, not now, but I am still willing to try. Matt shook his head. There were only two ways to deal with Aes Sedai without getting burned: let them walk all over you or stay away from them. He would not do the first, and could not do the second. So he had to find a third way, and he doubted it could come from following Satala's advice. Women's advice about Aes Sedai generally was to follow the first path, though they never worded it that way. They talked of accommodation, but it was never the Aes Sedai who do any accommodating. Half the reason. What's the other? Though he had been punched in the stomach. Tuon? You think I can't be trusted with Tuon? Mistress Anand laughed at him, a fine, rich laugh. You are a rogue, my lord. Now, some rogues make fine husbands once they've been tamed a little around the edges. My Jasper was a rogue when I met him. But you still think you can nibble a pastry here, nibble a pastry there, and dance off to the next. There's no dancing away from this one, Matt said, frowning up at the wagon door. The dice clicked away in his head. Not for me. He was not sure he really wanted to dance away anymore, but want and wish as he might, he was well and truly caught. Like that, is it? She murmured. Oh, you've chosen a fine one to break your heart. That's as may be, Mistress Anand, but I have my reasons. I'd better get inside before they eat everything. He turned toward the steps at the back of the wagon, and she laid a hand on his arm. Could I see it? Just to see? There was no doubt what she meant. He hesitated, then fished in the neck of his shirt for the leather cord that held the medallion. He could not have said why. He had refused Jolene and Edicina even a glimpse. It was a fine piece of work, a silver fox head nearly as big as his palm. Only one eye showed, and enough daylight remained to see, if you looked close, that the pupil was half shaded to form the ancient symbol of Aes Sedai. Her hand trembled slightly as she traced a finger around that eye. She had said she only wanted to see it, but he allowed the touching. She breathed out a long sigh. You were Aes Sedai once, he said quietly, and her hand froze. She recovered herself so quickly that he might have imagined it. She was stately Satala Anand, the innkeeper from Abu Dar, with the big golden hoops in her ears and the marriage knife dangling hilt down into her round cleavage, about as far from an Aes Sedai as could be. The sisters think I'm lying about never having been to the tower. They think I was a servant there as a young woman, and listened where I shouldn't have. They haven't seen you looking at this. He bounced the fox head once on his hand before tucking it safely back under his shirt. She pretended not to care, and he pretended not to know she was pretending. Her lips twitched into a brief, rueful smile, as if she knew what he was thinking. The sisters would see it if they could let themselves, she said, as simply as if she were discussing the chances of rain. But I said I expect that when certain things happen, the woman will go away decently and die soon after. I went away, but Jasper found me half-starved and sick on the streets of Abu Dar, and took me to his mother. She chuckled, just a woman telling how she met her husband. He used to take in stray kittens, too. Now you know some of my secrets, and I know some of yours. Shall we keep them to ourselves? What secrets of mine? He demanded, instantly wary. Some of his secrets were dangerous to have known, and if too many knew of them, they were not really secrets anymore. Mistress Anand glanced at the wagon, frowning. That girl is playing a game with you as surely as you are playing one with her. Not the same game that you are. She's more like a general plotting a battle than a woman being courted. If she learns you're moonstruck with her, though, she'll still gain the advantage. I'm willing to let you have an even chance, or as near to one as any man has with a woman of any brains. Do we have an agreement? We do, he replied fervently. That we do. He would not have been surprised if the dice stopped then, but they went on bouncing. Had the sisters' fixation on his medallion been the only problem they gave him, had they contented themselves with creating rumors everywhere the show stopped, he could have said those days were no more than tolerably bad for traveling with Aes Sedai. Unfortunately, by the time the show departed Jurador, they had learned who Tuon was. Not that she was the daughter of the Nine Moons, but that she was a Seanchan High Lady, someone of rank and influence. Do you take me for a fool? Luca protested when Matt accused him of telling them. He squared up beside his wagon, fists on his hips, a tall man full of indignation and ready to fight over it by his glare. That's a secret I want buried deep until she says I can use that warrant of protection. That won't be much use if she revokes it because I told something she wants hidden. But his voice was a shade too earnest, and his eyes shifted a hair from meeting Matt's directly. The truth of it was, Luca liked to boast nearly as much as he liked gold. He must have thought it was safe, to tell the sisters, and only realized the snarl he had created after the words were out of his mouth. A snarl it was, as tangled as a pit full of snakes. The High Lady Tuon, readily at hand, presented an opportunity no Aes Sedai could have resisted. Teslin was every bit as bad as Jolene and Edicina. The three of them visited Tuon in her wagon daily, and descended on her when she went out for a walk. They talked of truces and treaties and negotiations, tried to learn what connection she had to the leaders of the invasion, attempted to convince her to help arrange talks to end the fighting. They even offered to help her leave the show and return home. Unfortunately for them, Tuon did not see three Aes Sedai, representatives of the White Tower, perhaps the greatest power on Earth, not even after the seamstresses began delivering their riding dresses, and they could change out of the ragbag leavings Matt had been able to find for them. She saw two escaped Damani and a Marath Damani, and she had no use for either until they were decently collared. Her phrase, that. When they came to her wagon, she latched the door, and if they managed to get inside before she could, she left. When they cornered her, or tried to, she walked around them, the same as walking around a stump. They all but talked themselves hoarse, and she refused to listen. Any Aes Sedai could teach a stone patience if she had reason, yet they were unaccustomed to flat being ignored. Matt could see the frustration growing, the tight eyes and tighter mouths that took longer and longer to relax, the hands gripping skirts in fists to keep them from grabbing Tuon and shaking her. It all came to a head sooner than he expected, and not at all in the way he had imagined. The night after he gave Tuon the mare, he ate his supper with her and Salusha, and with Noel and Oliver, of course. That pair managed as much time with Tuon as he did. Lopin and Nerim, as formal as if they were in a palace instead of squeezed for room to move, served a typical early spring meal, stringy mutton with peas that had been dried and turnips that had sat too long in somebody's cellar. It was too early yet for anything to be near harvesting. Still, Open had made a pepper. Nero had found pine nuts for the peas. There was plenty to go around, and nothing tasted off, so it was as fine a meal as could be managed. Mulver left once supper was done, having already had his games with Tuon, and Matt changed places with Selucia to play stones. Noel remained too, despite any number of telling looks, rambling on about the Seven Towers and dead Melkir, which apparently had overtopped anything in Cairhien and Sholarbella, the city of 10,000 bells in Arafel, and all manner of borderland wonders, strange spires made of crystal harder than steel, and a metal bowl 100 paces across set into a hillside, and the like. Sometimes he interjected comments on Matt's play, that he was exposing himself on the left, that he was setting a fine trap on the right, and just when Tuon looked ready to fall into it. That sort of thing. Matt kept his mouth shut except for chatting with Tuon, though it took gritting his teeth more than once to accomplish. Tuon found Noel's natter entertaining. He was studying the board, wondering whether he might have a small chance of gaining a draw, when Jolene led Teslin and Edicina into the wagon like haughty on a pedestal, smooth-faced Aes Sedai to their toenails. Jolene was wearing her great serpent ring. Squeezing by Selucia, giving her very cold looks when she was slow to move aside, they arrayed themselves at the foot of the narrow table. Noel went very still, eyeing the sisters sideways, one hand beneath his coat, as if the fool thought his knives would do any good here. "There must be an end to this, High Lady," Jolene said, very pointedly ignoring Matt. She was telling, not pleading, announcing what would be because it had to be. "Your people have brought a war to these lands such as we have not seen since the War of the 100 Years, perhaps not since the Trolloc Wars. Armageddon is approaching, and this war must end before it comes, lest it bring disaster to the whole world. It threatens no less than that. So there will be an end to your petulance. You will carry our offer to whoever commands among you. There can be peace until you return to your own lands across the sea, or you can face the full might of the White Tower, followed by every throne from the borderlands to the Sea of Storms. The Amerlin seat has likely summoned them against you already. I have heard of vast borderland armies already in the south, and other armies moving. Better to end this without more bloodshed, though. So avert your people's destruction and help bring this peace." Matt could not see Edicina's reaction, but Teslin simply blinked. For an Aes Sedai, that was as good as a gasp. Maybe this was not exactly what she had expected Jolene to say. For his part, he groaned under his breath. Jolene was no Grey, as deft as a skilled juggler in negotiations, that was for sure, but neither was he, and he still figured she had found a short path to putting Tuon's back up. But Tuon folded her hands in her lap beneath the table and sat very straight, looking right through the Aes Sedai. Her face was as stern as it had ever been for him. "Selucia," she said quietly. Moving up behind Teslin, the yellow-haired woman bent long enough to take something from beneath the blanket Matt was sitting on. As she straightened, everything seemed to happen all at once. There was a click, and Teslin screamed, putting her hands to her throat. The fox head turned to ice against Matt's chest, and Jolene's head whipped around with an incredulous stare for the red. Edicina turned and ran for the door, which swung half open, then slammed shut. Slammed against Blerick or Fen by the sound of men falling down the wagon's steps. Edicina jerked to a halt and stood very stiffly, arms at her sides, and divided skirts pressed against her legs by invisible cords. All that in moments, and Selucia had not stayed still. She bent briefly to the bed Noel was sitting on, then snapped the silver collar of another Edam around Jolene's neck. Matt could see that was what Teslin was gripping with both hands. She was not trying to take it off, just holding on to it, but her knuckles were white. The red's narrow face was an image of despair, her eyes staring and haunted. Jolene had regained the utter calm of an Aes Sedai, but she did touch the segmented collar encircling her neck. "If you think you can," she began, then cut off abruptly, her mouth going tight. An angry light shone in her eyes. "You see, the Edam can be used to punish, though that is seldom done." Tuon stood, and she had the bracelet of an Edam on each wrist, the gleaming leashes snaking away under the blankets on the beds. How in the light had she managed to get her hands on those? "No," Matt said. You promised not to harm my followers, Precious. Maybe not the wisest thing to use that name now, but it was too late to call it back. You've kept your promises so far. Don't go back on one now. I promised not to cause dissension among your followers, Toy, she said snippily. And in any case, it is very clear that these three are not your followers. The small sliding door used to talk to whoever was driving or pass out food slid open with a loud bang. She glanced over her shoulder, and it slid shut with a louder. A man cursed outside and began beating at the door. The Adon can also be used to give pleasure as a great reward, Tuan told Jolene, ignoring the hammering fist behind her. Jolene's lips parted, and her eyes grew very wide. She swayed, and the rope-suspended table swung as she caught herself with both hands to keep from falling. If she was impressed, though, she hid it well. She did smooth her dark gray skirts once after she was upright again, but that might have meant nothing. Her face was all Aes Sedai composure. Edicina, looking over her shoulder, matched that calm gaze, although she now wore the third Adam around her neck. And come to it, her face was paler than usual. But Teslin had begun weeping silently, shoulders shaking, tears leaking down her cheeks. Noel was tensed, a man ready to do something stupid. Matt kicked him under the table, and when the man glared at him, shook his head. Noel's scowl deepened, but he took his hand out of his coat and leaned back against the wall. Still glaring. Well, let him. Knives were no use here, but maybe words could be. Much better if this could be ended with words. Listen, Matt said to Tuan. If you think you'll see 100 reasons this won't work, but you can learn to channel yourself. Doesn't knowing that change anything? You're not far different from them. He might as well have turned to smoke and blown away for all the attention she paid. Try to embrace Saidar, she drawled, stern eyes steady on Jolene. Her voice was quite mild in comparison to her gaze, yet plainly she expected obedience. Obedience? She looked a bloody leopard staring at 3 tethered goats. And strangely, more beautiful than ever. A beautiful leopard who might rake him with her claws as soon as the goats. Well, he had faced a leopard a few times before this, and those were his own memories. There was an odd sort of exhilaration that came with confronting a leopard. Go ahead, she went on. You know the shield is gone. Jolene gave a small grunt of surprise, and Tuan nodded. Good. You've obeyed for the first time, and learned that you cannot touch the power while you wear the Adam, unless I wish it. But now I wish you to hold the power, and you do, though you didn't try to embrace it. Jolene's eyes widened slightly, a small crack in her calm. And now, Tuan went on, I wish you not to be holding the power, and it is gone from you.
Be right back.
Your first lessons. Jolene drew a deep breath. She was beginning to look, not afraid, but uneasy. Blood and bloody ashes, woman, Matt growled. Do you think you can parade them around in those leashes without anyone noticing? A heavy thump came from the door. A second produced the sound of cracking wood. Whoever was beating at the wooden window was still at it too. Somehow that caused no sense of urgency. If the warders got in, what could they do? I will house them in the wagon they are using and exercise them at night, she snapped irritably. I am nothing like these women, Toy. Nothing like them. Perhaps I could learn, but I choose not to, just as I choose not to steal or commit murder. That makes all the difference. Recovering herself with visible effort, she sat down with her hands on the table, focused on the Aes Sedai once again. I've had considerable success with one woman like you. Edicina gasped, murmured a name too low to be caught. Yes, Tuan said. You must have met my Mylan in the kennels or at exercise. I will train you all as well as she is.
You have been cursed with a dark taint, but I will teach you to have pride in the service you give the Empire. I didn't bring these three out of Abu Dar so you could take them back, Matt said firmly, sliding himself along the bed. The fox head grew colder still, and Tuan made a startled sound. How did you do that, Toy? The weave melted when it touched you. It's a gift, precious. As he stood up, Selucia started toward him, crouching, her hands outstretched and pleading. Fear painted her face. You must not, she began. No, Tuan said sharply. Selucia straightened and backed away, though she kept her eyes on him. Strangely, the fear vanished from her expression. He shook his head in wonder. He knew the bosomy woman obeyed Tuan instantly. She was Sojin, after all, as much owned as Tuan's horse, and she actually thought that right and good. But how obedient did you need to be to lose your fear at an order? They have annoyed me, Toy, Tuan said as he put his hands on Teslin's collar. Still trembling, tears still streaming down her cheeks, the red looked as though she could not believe he would actually remove the thing. They annoy me, too. Placing his fingers just so, he pressed, and the collar clicked open. Teslin seized his hands and began kissing them. Thank you, she wept over and over. Thank you, thank you. Matt cleared his throat. You're welcome, but there's no need for it. Would you stop that? Teslin, reclaiming his hands, took some effort. I want them to stop annoying me, Toy, Tuan said as he turned to Jolene. From anyone else, that might have been petulant. The dark little woman made it a demand. I think they'll agree to that after this, he said dryly. But Jolene was looking up at him with a stubborn set to her jaw. You will agree, won't you? The green said nothing. I do agree, Teslin said quickly. We do all agree. Yes, we all agree, Edicina added. Jolene stared at him silently, stubbornly, and Matt sighed. I could let Precious keep you for a few days until you change your mind. Jolene's collar clicked open in his hands. But I won't. Still staring into his eyes, she touched her throat as though to confirm the collar was gone. Would you like to be one of my warders? She asked, then laughed softly. No need to look like that. Even if I would bond you against your will, I couldn't so long as you have that Tyron Griol. I agree, Master Cawthon. It may cost our best chance to stop the Shon-Chen, but I will no longer bother Precious. Tuan hissed like a doused cat, and he sighed again. What you gained on the swings, you lost on the roundabouts. He spent part of that night doing what he liked least in the world. Working. Digging a deep hole to bury the three Adom. He did the job himself because, surprisingly, Jolene wanted them. They were Tyron Griol, after all, and the White Tower needed to study them. That might be so, but the Tower would just have to find their Adom elsewhere. He was fairly certain that none of the Red Arms would have handed them over if he told them to bury the things, yet he was taking no chances that they would reappear to cause more trouble. It started raining before the hole was knee-deep. A cold, driving rain, and by the time he was done, he was soaked to the skin and mud to his waist. A fine end to a fine night, with the dice bouncing around his skull. Chapter 10. A village in Shiota. The following day brought a respite, or so it seemed. Tuan, in a blue silk riding dress and her wide tooled leather belt, not only rode beside him as the show rolled slowly north, she waggled her fingers at Selucia when the woman tried to put her done.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.